Hi, I'm Amy Porter. Some of you know me as a flutist and a classical musician, others as a professor, and some of you know me as a publisher and arranger. I'm a stepmom, I'm a business owner, and I'm the founder of a couple of nonprofits. And this is my podcast. My core mission as an entrepreneur is to appreciate what I have around me. And then I try and see as clearly as possible how I can help. So let's talk, let's share information, let's laugh and sometimes cry over the things that we have to work through in life and in music, in business and family and relationships. Come on into my PorterFlute Pod. Welcome to PorterFlute Pod. It's Season 2, Episode 20, and you're in our Friendcast episode. Joining me in sharing a love for flute and saxophone is Dr. Timothy McAllister, Grammy Award-winning performer and extraordinary pedagogue. Listen in on our conversation if you want to raise your own musical bar. We'll discuss real situations in the practice room, hybridizing pedagogical influences, and what to know when you're on the gig. We'll celebrate our mentor, Donald J. Sinta. Donald Sinta has been a great influence on so many of us. We thought we'd mention him throughout. Joining us in the pod is Justine Sedke and Alan J. Tomasetti, and we decided to feature my performance with Dr. McAllister. It's available on YouTube. It's for flute and saxophone and piano. It's called Epitaph de Jean Harlow, Opus 164, written in 1937 by Charles Koechlin. The pianist is Liz Ames. Welcome to PorterFlute Pod. We're so glad you're here. Welcome to PorterFlute Pod, Dr. McAllister.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I met you as a student. Can you talk about how many degrees you hold from the University of Michigan? It's staggering. All right, everybody, here we go. Tell me about all your degrees.
So, I have back before they split the degree into 2 degrees, I was a wind instrument C major for bachelor's. So that meant that it was a performance degree with teaching certification. That's all it meant. Now at Michigan, that is separated into 2 separate degrees, music education and performance. The students walk away with literally 2 pieces of paper. So I was wind C. And then I stayed for the master's, and I did a master's in performance and a master's in conducting, wind conducting. I was recruited by Gustav Meyer for orchestra to be orchestra conducting major, but then he retired. And no offense to Ken Kiesler, but I worshipped Bob Reynolds, and so really I kind of shifted and pivoted my interest to study with Robert Reynolds and to be a wind conducting major. So that was 2, and then the first degree was 1, so that's 3 degrees. Then I graduated with those degrees, and then I got my first teaching position right out of my master's degree at the State University of New York at Potsdam, Crane School of Music, where you have a former student teaching there now. And that was my first job out of Michigan. And I was there for 3 years. But when I was hired at the time, the dean at the time said, if you're going to get tenure here, you will have to have a doctorate. So I said to him at the time, I'm not prepared to be here for close to a decade and then turn right around and go back to school. So I said, if I'm to have the doctorate for tenure, then you have to facilitate me being able to go back to school. So we worked out this arrangement that I would teach for 3 years and then go get my doctorate. And, at the time it felt strange to try to force another degree onto, out of Michigan, but it was easiest path to go back to school. And because I did 2 masters at Michigan, it meant that I could really do an express doctorate is really what it meant. So I arranged, after my 3rd year, I went on leave, academic leave from Potsdam, and I did my coursework in 1 year of the DMA, and that's where I met you. And so I went back, and so yes, 4 degrees from the University of Michigan. I am guilty of bleeding maize and blue.
Were you taking lessons the whole time? Was he on you still about, your scales and your etudes, and is he still at that level giving you all Donald Sinta gave?
Yeah, he did. Certainly in the master's degree. I mean, that was certainly, continuation of that work. I think like with all of us with our students, the longer and longer we're with our students, it does feel like we become slightly more hands off as they get closer to, to really jumping out into the world. I think we start to become more of a mentor and a guide through the profession more than we are hammering them on their scales and all of that. But he was always right up until the very end, and he was going to call you out on everything. During my doctorate, now was interesting because I did my coursework in 1 year, so I was in residence for 1 year. But he left in the middle of the year for a sabbatical. So he handed the studio over to me, and I was like a visiting instructor sabbatical replacement for the saxophone studio while I was doing my DMA. So I was the teaching assistant who had been elevated to the sabbatical replacement. I was really stressed. So I got 1 semester with him as a DMA student, other than coming back to do my recitals. And most of our lessons were him saying, let's go across the street and have coffee. And they were great. Those were just as good as any lesson of him just calling me out on something or working on rep. There was one major lesson I had with him, and I was going to premiere this concerto by Andrew Mead, who was, our chair of our theory department at the time, wrote this gnarly, crazy saxophone concerto. We had to pay players to play the parts. And it was a whole retrospective of his music that was done at Rackham Auditorium downtown. And it was this wild concerto. I spent probably 2 years working on it, and with this idea that we would play it for this occasion. And I distinctly remember having this lesson where Don didn't know the piece. I mean, he had seen it before. He just kind of scoffed at it as ridiculous, and it's not like felt like he was ever going to learn it. But we had this lesson where I came in to play it, and he switched into his reading glasses. He had the full score out, and I played it for him, and he took me for a ride. It was a great lesson because he didn't know the piece, and he saw and heard everything. And it just really, really reminded me of just how ensconced he was in the whole new music scene in the 1960s and 70s, and how that never left him, and his ability to like tear through a score and call you out on every little thing and see and hear it in this expansive way, when he was also intimidated to try to talk about it because he didn't know how to play it. So it was not about any of the notes, it was about only music. And I think that to me is when I started to truly understand the importance of teaching being not about outplaying your students. Great teaching is not about outplaying your students. And that was something. I mean, he could outplay you on anything that he knew, but I think with his older students, when he wanted them to reach out into worlds of repertoire and composers that he had no knowledge of, right? That was his job, to push us into that world. So if we were going to bring something to him that he didn't know, it was never going to be about outplaying us. It was going to be about helping us like discover what to do with this music further. And so I think I do believe it was my one actual like applied lesson I had in my DMA with him. And it was a great one. It's funny.
Donald Sinta's studio that you were in was an amazing studio. I was at the concerts. I was sitting with him at meetings. I was listening to him. I learned so much from him about just how to treat a studio, sensing. And I would go as far as to say that sensing is a good ability in academia. Donald Sinta taught me to sense. He taught me to make sure your students are in the practice room by 7:30 a.m. And once I proposed that, they were. And guess what? He would come back and tell me who was in the practice room at 7:30 and what kind of scale they were doing. I've already told one Donald Sinta story on this podcast, and he is so venerable because of his outspokenness, because of his humor, because of the way he's such a gentleman that never, ever did you feel overburdened or threatened in his teaching. So the first thing I want to ask is, was circular breathing mandatory for every sax player?
No, I would say in terms of his curriculum? No.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I think no, but I certainly know that he felt that the tides were turning in our repertoire, that we were reaching a point where where a decade earlier, or at least a decade earlier than when you and I met, certainly we had reached a point where altissimo register training was mandatory. We were starting to hit the kind of new frontier of what we call extended techniques, where circular breathing had been around for decades. I mean, there were famous jazz musicians circular breathing in the 60s, you know, and trumpet players were circular breathing in the 30s. So, you know, there was a sense that it was integrated in wind culture, but it wasn't necessarily showing up in literature, right? Unless you wanted to play a Bozza etude with, you know, circular breathing all the way through. That was probably in his mind at the, you know, in the 80s and 90s, that would have been something closer to a gimmick. But what we started to see starting in the 1990s was there was literature being written in which circular breathing was an element of the theatrics of the piece. You probably saw that maybe with some Robert Dick's music, or some of the, you know, some of this repertoire. You know, we've seen this in other clarinet. The clarinet world has some of those composers where they're writing for the techniques, right? And so I'd say by the 90s, he was switching over to this idea that, hey, there's a movement within our repertoire. I'm not necessarily equipped to demonstrate that, but he was the best at leading us to the resources. If there was something he couldn't honestly do, whether it was slap tonguing or circular breathing, he could get us there without having to necessarily demonstrate it himself. And that is a great mark of a teacher. So I'd say in my studio, what's now happened over the course of a 20-year arc, in that case, it is mandatory in my studio, right? We've reached a point where, and you know, this may come up later in this discussion, but I mean, not to take anything away from my wind colleagues, but you have an amazing profession that's relatively been set for a long time. I mean, you've added to the profession, but the status quo of the profession is at least 100 years old. If you want to talk about Marcel Moïse, and you want to talk about, you know, the great clarinet pedagogues of the turn of the 20th century, or you want to talk about Tabito in the turn of the 20th century in the oboe world, I mean, the landmarks of pedagogy have been established for a long time. And with saxophone, we are in the middle of it. We are in the middle of constantly defining it. And that's what's exciting about it. But it's also, it also creates kind of a flux that we have to be able to navigate those waters, because if the students don't kind of keep up to date with that, then they can kind of graduate behind they can come in as an advanced player, and if they're not kind of in the same stream with the rest of the salmon, then they're going to be completely lost when they graduate. So that actually creates a bit of stress, I find, in the studio teaching in the saxophone world right now.
Kind of like memory for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Memory requirement, but yeah. Hey, it's what makes a performance. Yeah, I mean, I think that, and isn't that interesting that, like, that's a developing trend in wind culture that hasn't existed. I mean, if you're a violinist playing core repertoire, there's no question you play from memory, but it's certainly not uncommon to see even very famous wind players not playing a standard concerto from memory. And so it feels like, and maybe it's more so in the flute world, but like that's just another element of expectation that has found its way, and certainly in my studio, that they do that very well. And we're now upping the ante and requiring that all their chamber music is memorized, you know, and today is Fischoff, you know, and I have two quartets that are in the quarterfinals of Fischoff, and their entire programs are from memory. And that's where we've raised the bar on ourselves in order to feel like we can have a place at the table. It's like flutist, flautist question or flautist. The question is, do you ever have to clarify that it's classical saxophone?
Yeah, all the time. And now we're kind of in some interesting discussions about whether or not that is an overtly and unnecessary classist terminology. Like, I mean, we're dealing with that all the time. Like, so is it truly classical saxophone, or are we talking about something else? Is it concert music? Are we concert saxophonists, right? Do we categorize all art music as classical music? So there's a lot. I think there are going to be some people that would say they don't like the term classical saxophone. Yet, where I think we've evolved is the fact that there's a recognition of multiple genres for the instruments. So if someone asks you in an elevator, oh, you're a musician, what's that case you have over your shoulder? And you're like, oh, I play saxophone. And then gone are the days that someone would say, oh, yeah, man, like Coltrane, can you play some giant steps for me or something? I mean, that's impressive in and of itself if someone would ask that. But I do think you run into situations where people will say, oh, really? Do you play classical or jazz? So
Okay, good.
So that might be an actual moment of evolution for the instrument. If you say both, then that's more power to you. But we have so many classifications because the jazz purists won't necessarily support the crossover fusion, rock jazz players or the pop jazz players and the R&B soul players. You have this constant disparagement of major commercial figures, which is unfounded, like Kenny G, for instance. It's like, Kenny G doesn't care what any of us think of him. He's doing just fine, But if you look at categories, if you're talking about categories, well, Kenny G is not in the category of a jazz artist.
Yeah.
If you put him in the category of R&B or soul music or some other kind of pop infused genre, then you know what, he's king of that, so I'm going to support that. But in the classical side, like interestingly we have these kind of purists that feel that the classical side of the instruments must always still kind of bow to the French tradition. And someone like Donald Sinta was a trailblazer in the American contemporary avant-garde, and so we found that our true home resided there, at least in America. We found that it wasn't necessary nor mandatory that we try to reconstitute a Paris Conservatory curriculum. And in doing so, I would venture to say that we found ourselves by not being beholden to the way it was done in Paris for 100 years.
I love that so much.
It's helped, and that's helped define us. And that's so if we want to talk about what an American school is, those are discussions we get into. And I think I don't like tribalism. It invariably happens. We can't help it. There's the very nature of coming to Michigan ultimately means you're subscribing to a certain kind of tribal philosophy of Donald Sinta's teaching and his way of playing and his teacher's teacher, Larry Teal's way. And a lot of that was very antithetical to the Paris style. And yet, for me as a teacher, I've tried to break down those barriers a little bit. Well, not a little bit. I'd say very actively. I will certainly speak. So the great patriarch of the French school is the current Paris Conservatory professor, Claude Delong. And Claude is a dear friend, and I adore him and his playing. And, if I was to describe my ideal pedagogy, it would be a mix of his and Donald Sinta's, because there's such strength on both sides.
That's beautiful.
And I've tried to hybridize it. I have actively tried to hybridize it. And I also taught at Northwestern briefly. And one of Sinta's great contemporaries was Frederick Hemke. And Hemke came right out of that mid-century Paris Conservatory model. And Hemke was the American equivalent of the Paris system. And teaching at Northwestern opened me up to the idea that I needed to follow those footsteps. I needed to pay homage to that man as well, even though I never studied with him. And I wanted to know more and more about the hallmarks of his teaching. And I just feel that's made me a better teacher all around, because some of those solutions will correct certain problems, and some of Sinta's solutions will correct other problems, and some of DeLong's in Paris will correct. So I think my students are pretty worldly now. I think my students can play the game, and they could drop in on any country or any kind of musical environment, and they can navigate those waters. That's maybe my greatest source of pride right now. We are not a conservatory embedded in a large city with part-time faculty that come and go every day. So the mandate on us is to do more creative work. As you know, Doug Perkins, our dear new percussion colleague, would say, schmooze locally, play globally. And that was our mantra even in Chicago. But in a place like, New York, Manhattan or Juilliard, I mean, those faculty, maybe some of them, a lot of them may be part-time, but they live there, and their jobs and their performing life is built around the living there. For us, so much of what it is in our life is performing is about to go elsewhere. So I talk with my own students about the fact that our faculty bring the world to them, as opposed to essentially being embedded in downtown Chicago or LA or whatever, where they're kind of in the middle of a hotbed of things, but their faculty are coming and going. But we don't. Our kids, all they have to do, if they live on North Campus, all they have to do is get on a 10-minute bus ride to go hear the Berlin Philharmonic in Hill Auditorium. I mean, it's like, are you serious? I mean, and Philadelphia's coming for a residency, and New York's been here. I mean, every orchestra comes to Ann Arbor, and every time I've ever traveled to orchestras to play with orchestras, and it comes up that I'm from Ann Arbor, every single person will say to me, "Oh my God, we love that hall," because they all know the hall. Like, I was with Bavarian Radio Orchestra, Bavarian Radio Symphony, and they were like, "Oh, Ann Arbor, we're going there next year. We love Hill Auditorium," and to be able to tell our students that we bring the world to them, I feel like it's the same mantra that our studio teaching should be, that we're bringing the world to them. They came and they were playing Rachmaninoff symphonic dances, and everywhere they traveled to, they brought in a ringer from the local community to play the sax solo. So guess who they asked to play the Rachmaninoff symphonic dances in Hill Auditorium? Donald Sinta. So Donald Sinta, I think I was a sophomore. St. Petersburg, Donald Sinta playing Rachmaninoff symphonic dances. And the entire article the next day in the Ann Arbor News was about Donald Sinta in that moment.
I love that.
It was as if I don't remember who wrote the article, but they'd never heard something like that in their whole life. And it basically, he obliterated the whole evening for the orchestra, and all people wanted to talk about was Donald Sinta's sound in that solo. In my case, with my quartet on one side and then a solo career on the other side of that, like I reached the point where I'm just too saturated, and I have to make a choice. I either have to sub out a quartet gig if I just can't be gone for a month, because I can't do 2 weeks with my quartet and then go do a week or two with an orchestra. That kills a whole month of teaching, right? And so I have my limits, and I have to be able to navigate that. I can't say that one matters more than the other. I certainly love the audiences, the size of audiences of an orchestra concert. But my quartet they're my brothers, and we are a single organism. And when one of us doesn't play in the group, it may be called the Prism Quartet. But if one of us is subbed out, then the sound of the group is completely thrown off. And so we work really hard 2 or 3 years in advance to organize our calendars, so that we're not running up against my solo opportunities and then the solo opportunities for the other members of the group, because they're active also. And we're fortunately, we work it out. I think 98% of the time we worked it out where the stars are aligning and our calendars are working for our teaching schedules and our solo opportunities and everything that works out with the quartet. I think the COVID pandemic really messed up everyone's calendars for gigging, right? Things were pushed, but you had the combination of things that were postponed versus things that were being just straight canceled. And I had a lot of stuff that was simply just postponed. And now it's all being pushed into sort of like the same time of year. And I've run into some conflicts where I can't do certain things for my quartet and the solo gigs. So those are hard choices to make.
Can we turn to this fabulous John Adams concerto, and can you talk about the genesis of that and premiering that piece and working with him?
I teach a like a little PowerPoint seminar to when I've gone out and done some of these Zoom master classes. I teach a thing called the 7 spheres of awareness, and it's like how to curate a musical life, like seven spheres that emanate from the center, and the center sphere, like on the of any kind of concentric circles, that center sphere is just you, the sense of self, the sense of someone who is, where all of your energy and all of your fuel has to emanate from the practice room. All of that inspiration has to be about your love for practicing, right? In that talk, I talk about one of the spheres. I think it's the sphere 6, which is or maybe 7, I can't remember now. It's your 15 minutes of fame, quote unquote. When that happens, how and when that will happen. And it's going to be different and differently calibrated for every single kind of person and player and point in their life and instrument and genre, because your 15 minutes of fame could be the moment you get called to sub in an orchestra, and you need to show up and you need to shine. And if you do well, you will be remembered and you will be called again. And if that's all that it took for you to have some kind of spotlight put upon you in a positive way, then it's crucial you're ready for that moment, right? So all the spheres have to reach out eventually to that, to get to the point that you're ready for that opportunity for 15 minutes of quote fame. So yeah, I think I look at the John Adams as my 15 minutes of fame, but I think it was born out of an earlier piece, the large 35-minute symphony he wrote called City Noir. And that piece was commissioned and written for Gustavo Dudamel's inaugural concert with the Los Angeles Philharmonic. It was his first week on the job, and that was going to be the first concert at the end of that first week. And they commissioned this huge John Adams piece for this occasion, and it was about a celebration of LA. And John felt, after years of pressure from saxophonists all over the world to like include some more saxophone in your parts, because he did it throughout the 80s and he stopped, by 1990 he didn't include saxophone anymore in his music, like Nixon in China and Fearful Symmetries and these pieces, but he wrote a piece. He felt that he couldn't write a piece about the history of LA and cinema and Hollywood without that sense of without the sense of a sultry saxophone presence in that score. So he kind of went and took that and ran with it, because he didn't just include saxophone as some kind of bit part. The saxophone is literally like the quarterback of the wind section. The driver of the entire wind sound is coming from the saxophone roll. So in essence, it's like a concerto from a seated position. And I remember getting the first page of it because they had asked a regular, someone that usually would play with them. They showed them the part and said, will you play this? Or are you comfortable playing this? And the response was, no way. And so like, well, first of all, that was, you should never say no, but I guess you have to know your limits, and you have to respect someone who would look at something and say, no way, I'm sorry. And that was just really indicative of how hard the part was. So he wanted this big saxophone feature. They sent me the part, and I said, I looked at it and I was like, yeah, that's hard, but if not any harder than like major, solo rep I play, or I played, or things I've seen in my quartet or something. But I looked at it and I said, they said, well, this is just page 1 and the part's coming and it's huge, right? This, the piece is 35 minutes. But I said, well, of course, yeah, I'll be free for that. Are you serious? Of course I'll be free for that. So I was in Phoenix at the time, so it was easy for me to get to LA. So it worked out really great. And so I show up. The saxophone part was printed first, and I had the part in August before an October 9th premiere, whatever it was. And I knew I even with LA and even with it being Dudamel's first week, I know the orchestra culture when it comes to new music. And a lot of players will wait to the last minute to learn their parts sometimes, or, I knew that I had to show up. And if the case was being made for the saxophone to have this major of a role in a piece that wasn't a concerto, then I had such enormous pressure I put upon myself to show up and nail that part in the first rehearsal. I think that was really important to me. So I had the full score. I was studying that like crazy. I had a MIDI of the whole piece. And I prepared for that moment as if my life depended on it. And I would dare say that I succeeded in that venture, because in that first rehearsal, the shock from everyone about what this part was and how hard it was and how well it was played in that first rehearsal, I feel like that was the moment that I kind of arrived, quote unquote, onto a larger classical tier, where someone like Dudamel is looking at me and saying, "Who in the hell are you? Wow." And then at the end of that rehearsal, John Adams was like, "Come here, let's,
Wow.
let's talk." I think John was shocked at how well I played it in the first rehearsal, in the reading rehearsal. But I mean, I think it led to the series of performances. We went on tour with the piece that year. I think within 1 year, I think I played it eight or nine times. And then I played it with John conducting in Toronto, because they were one of the co-commissioners of the piece, so the Toronto Symphony. And then I think maybe a year later, I did it with John conducting New World Symphony. And while we were in Miami, I think this would have been December of 2010. In December, we went out to dinner one night, and I'm going to dinner with John Adams. I'm like, right there, I'm like, pinch me. But we're going to dinner, and he's like, "You know what? I think I need to write you a concerto." And then it was kind of weird, because he said that, and I freaked out. But I said, "Just keep it cool, McAllister. Don't just go crazy on him. I don't want to scare him away. Don't scare him away." And he said to me, "So if I write a piece for you, do I have to include like all those multiphonics?" And I'm like, and I said, "No." I said, "You don't have to put any of that in there if you don't want." He's like, "Okay, good. Thank you." And he's like, "What else? What else should I put in there?" And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, well, you do know the saxophone's range now is basically 4 octaves. And he's like, no, I hate those top notes. And I was like, "Okay, all right, fine." And I think we mentioned slap tonguing and things like that, because he used that in the baritone part of Nixon in China. But he didn't, he said that, and he didn't want to do any of that stuff. He just wanted to write a really pure piece. But then he dropped it. He didn't drop it. Time went by, and I didn't know how to handle that. If I was going to follow up with him or bother him, I didn't want to be bothering John Adams in an email, or like whoever gets his email, or whatever agent screens his email. I didn't want to be bothering him about this piece. But I also knew that this was my chance. This might be my chance, or my only chance in my life. But then it was quiet for 2 years. And then, in the meantime, I had been playing City Noir more and more. I think by 2012, I think by January 2012, I had played City Noir already at that point by like 25 times around the world. And then I get this phone call out of the blue in 2012, and I was in Evanston. Oh no, this is right. So 2012 is later. It was in the fall of 2012. And I'm in Evanston, and he calls me and says, "I've got this gig down in Sydney. I'm going to conduct a Sydney Symphony, and I'd like to write a concerto for you to premiere with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. And are you free?" Are you free? And I literally, and I tell my wife all that, she knows this story because she was with me. We were at a diner in Evanston, and I dropped my fork with food on it. And, it was literally a flabbergasting moment that John Adams is proposing this to me. And it was set for August of 2013. And, it was going to happen. Not only was it happening, it was like a dream come true. It wasn't just happening. It was happening very quickly. And And, I truly believe, and I try to tell this story to my kids to convey the message that you don't know when you need to be at your best. And it can be any time, and you never know who's listening. It could be a conductor, a composer, a publisher, an agent. It could be a faculty member who will have impact on voting for you for an award or an audition or something. It can be anything, and it can matter, and so I think that moment with the LA Philharmonic was my moment to make the impression I needed to make with John. And I felt like I had a career to that point, but at that moment is when it just went in a whole new direction. So in 2015, the Grammy for the City Noir Saxophone Concerto album, that was for Best Orchestra Performance.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Well, and I mean, I would have loved to have been, best instrumental solo, but they don't do that for concertos as much. I mean, I guess, and it really tends to be so. And the fact is, the entire album is about saxophone. So I felt like it was a legitimate Grammy, even though it really goes to like the conductor and the orchestra, and that's fine. But with my quartet, with Prism, we were part of the best choral performance Grammy of a piece by Gavin Bryars called The Fifth Century, and it's for chorus and sax quartet. And that it's the entire album. It's an unbelievably beautiful, heartbreaking piece.
Oh, I can't wait to check it out.
Well, that won the Grammy that won the Grammy. I want to say the following year or 2 years, 2 years later, and that was for best choral performance. And then the Grammy that the Kenneth Fuchs album won was for Best Classical Compendium. And so that the whole album was 4 concertos: the saxophone concerto, a piano concerto, electric guitar concerto, and a countertenor solo voice cycle. And yeah, so that album won for the Best Classical Compendium of the year. And, so I'm at least I got a quarter of that Grammy, so.
That's so exciting. How important is the flute to learn if you're a saxophone player? And what kind of things do you learn from flute players to play the saxophone?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly look to the flute as our aspirational goal for what flutists are able to do. In my teaching, and I think the way most of us feel, is we're always kind of stealing bits and pieces of the best things about every instrument. There's something very magical about how beautiful a clarinet can play soft in the low register, and just maybe that stridence on the top. The depth of the bassoon, the reediness of the bassoon, that kind of woody lyricism of the oboe. With flute, it's the spin, right? It's just the activity of the air. It's the resonance of sound that has to be generated by the performer, right? I mean, now of course a $30,000 flute is still better than a $200 flute. And I never experienced, I didn't even know about that until the first time I ever tried a really nice, I guess it was a really nice Haynes flute, when I had been playing a Gemeinhardt M2 for about like 3 years. And then I tried a Haynes flute, and I was shocked at how much difference it made. I mean, it made me not feel like I was the worst flute player in the world, So I worked so hard on a student level instrument to try to make a decent sound. And I learned a lot from that. Now that's true with saxophone also. Beginner instruments are very accessible, but there's a massive difference once we start talking about an expensive saxophone. But in the end, just like with flute, like we are in charge of the sound. And we can talk equipment all day long. We can talk about plating, and we can talk about, densities of alloys and all of that, and precious metals. But and Don Sinta was a great flute player. Like when he played flute, it was amazing. And he did that his whole teenage life and undergrad life. He was gigging in Detroit, and all those books, if you wanted to work, you needed to be able to play the books that had flute in it. And so this idea of saxophone and clarinet was always a no-brainer. You do have to shut things off when we play clarinet. It's not an easy double. It's not as easy a double as people think. It's the behavior of the clarinet and the kind of the constricted nature of the cylindrical bore. But when you get into that kind of the resonance of the conical element of the flute, then we're starting to kind of generate what the role of the vocal tract, the role of the air support. It's playing a big part in how sound is created. So I think that's why we look to the flute. The discussion of the pedagogy of the oral tract is as early as the modern flute itself. And
that's right.
And what we brought, or what Larry Teal and later Donald Sinta brought to the forefront in the pedagogy, is the role of the oral tract, or the vocal tract, in the oral cavity. But then it was that perception of what you gain from playing flute by both Larry Teal, who played flute and clarinet in the Detroit Symphony. He would still call himself a saxophonist, but he was good enough to play those instruments in the DSO. And then he kind of decided to specialize, and he was hired at Michigan to be the saxophone professor, this new post, the first of its kind, to say, we need formal training on this instrument finally. And he was the first one that Ravelli called. But it was Teal's flute playing that Sinta would say informed his saxophone playing. It was Sinta's flute playing that informed his saxophone playing. And if we go all the way back to the inventor, Adolph Sax. Well, Adolph Sax was a flute player and a clarinet player. His vision for the instrument was that it was could be a 4-octave instrument, yet the scale was 2.5 octaves. And so from the nature of your instrument and saxophone, we are at the very core an overblowing instrument on that BAME system. And that, I think, is for us, where that's a part of our teaching, that's still in its infancy, because we will still have students that come to college that have yet to discover that and have that awareness of the oral cavity. We're going to be reading Quantz and Kincaidiana, and we're going to be reading we're all going to be, and for me, it's required to do the Marcel Moïse, The Art of Sonority, because that book, when you take just the straight art of sonority and you just play it on saxophone, from the very first exercise, you're dealing with overblowing and extended range and sustain and air support. So I don't know. I mean, and I think just with the flute culture in general, you're so fortunate. I know it creates kind of a density of talent and saturation of talent, but you have so many stars, and I love that about the flute world. You have so many stars like you, and you're some of your closest, dearest friends and mentors. You've all navigated the profession in a way that you all have a seat at the table, and you've been able to promote your instrument, and you've been able to bring a lot of attention to the instrument. So on a kind of business and professional model, I think saxophone players are looking to flutists all the time. I thrive in mixed company, and I love being able to talk to you about your instrument. And I like to be able to talk shop with clarinet and flute players, or clarinet and oboe players. I like to be able to talk shop with brass players. And I feel like that at least gives a shred of credibility to me as a musician, that I can speak their language. And I don't expect you to speak my language. And none of us as saxophone players should expect you to speak our language. But if we want to belong, we've got to speak your language in the classical side of things. And that means showing up, obviously early, showing up and being as prepared as you can possibly be. But you can't just know your part. You've got to know the first clarinet's part and the way the sound that they're making, because that's going to determine the reed sound in that row. If you're in the end of that row next to bass clarinet, you better be able to hear left to that first clarinet, and you better be able to hear forward to principal flute and principal oboe. And we have a whole history of people that, in my opinion, haven't done that well. And that's why we've got to keep raising the bar on how I train my students. So I'm instituting next year a whole new plan with my students that, it's just got to be more, not that they're going to all graduate a program and walk into like orchestral subbing opportunities. But right now, my kids are first calls for the New World Symphony for any saxophone needs. My kids are first call. It's been that way for almost 10 years now. I feel very fortunate there. So I know I have to get them ready. If they're going to go down and play symphonic dances of Bernstein for MTT, they're going to get eviscerated if they don't know what they're doing when they get there.
That's right.
So that is a training ground that I can provide. If you're not setting students up to be able to sub at the drop of a hat and walk into that and understand the culture of what they're into, they're going to sink. They're not going to swim. And so I'm trying to build not an orchestral model in the saxophone studio, but I'm trying to breed an orchestral mentality that feeds the solo playing and feeds the chamber ensemble playing. We learn to get excited about like the ability to be this chameleon, and I've always loved that. I think it's allowed me to have a career in that arena, because I know how to get inside all those sounds, and I think that's the core of what chamber music teaches us, to figure out how to get inside of all those sounds, how to stack your overtones with an oboist or to stack your overtones with a flute player.
Oh my gosh, overtones.
Yes.
All right, we can't end without giving some Donald Sinta advice. One summer at Impulse, he looked at the high schoolers and he said, "You all play so out of tune. And he pointed to the pond that we have. He said, "You just killed all the fish in the pond." The kids didn't even laugh. They were staring, "Oh God."
They were gobsmacked. They came for a summer camp, and they were obliterated.
They killed all the fish in the pond. Oh my gosh. Okay, so is there a place we can go for some Don Sinta-isms?
Hold on.
Is there a repository on Facebook?
There is. Hold on. I think it's still here. Let me check it out.
Okay, because
there was a hashtag.
We've got to end with some classic Don Sinta-isms like that.
I think the hashtag is Sintaped. Hashtag Sintaped. PED. I have a couple of Sintaped quotes.
Good.
So here's one. The tonal makeup of your sound is like layers of a cake, avoiding having too much sugary frosting on it. So that's one. Let's see. So here's another one. There are two things that nobody will tell you to your face: if you have bad BO and if you have bad intonation. That's a good one. That's a good one for your listeners. I remember once sitting in a sectional at Interlock in high school, and he came in and to run our section rehearsal, and there was a young baritone player who was putting the instrument together, who hadn't really played a lot of baritone saxophone. We don't all play baritone and tenor. We get put on those instruments when we go off for band festivals in all states and come to college, but we're all really bred as alto sax players. And then we have
Are they the same fingerings?
Yeah, it's all the same. It's exact same keyboard, just like bass flute and alto flute and all of that. But you're dealing with a different ergonomic and size and weight and blowing style and embouchure size. And the reed is literally, exponentially larger as you get larger. So you're not going to see a high school kid typically thrive on the soprano saxophone. It just requires ultimately too much embouchure strength. And so, or at least certainly the junior high level. So we wouldn't start a kid out on a small saxophone. You can't really do that. I know you can wrap your head joint, but the tenor and baritone, those could be a real reach for young players. But there was a young man playing baritone saxophone in my section, and he was trying to play and warm up, and Sinta stopped and looked at him and he said, "Are you proud of that sound?"
That's good.
It's a good one. Are you proud of that sound?
Yeah.
And at the very core, I guess we all have to ask ourselves that: Are we proud of that sound that we make? And he said to me once in a lesson, we were working on scales, and he was like, "Do you want me to go get the janitor? Because the janitor will be." He's like, "Because the janitor will be able to tell you if you're playing your scales better than me or not. so
He loved the janitor. He
I
told me
know.
that the janitor was the one person you had to befriend in life.
That's
at
right.
every job.
Absolutely. They're in charge of everything. And the janitor will know if you play out of tune. They'll hear it.
When I finally met Don Sinta for the very first time, he was waiting for my arrival in a car at the front of the Moore building. And I got out of the car, and there he was with his white hair and his sunglasses. Well, they weren't sunglasses. They were the lenses that would change.
The photos.
Yeah. And the first thing he said to me was, Amy Porter, thank goodness you look like your photo.
Wow. Okay.
Because then he went on to explain not a lot of people look like their press shots.
Well, that's true. Yeah. No, that's a great compliment. That's a very high compliment.
So.
Very high compliment.
I left, and he was my mentor for so many years, as you know, and gosh, when he tried to retire, we talked him out of it.
I know.
And
rightfully so. I mean, honestly, he wasn't old. He was not old. He was not old enough to retire, and he had too much creative life left in him, and he has too much teaching left in him, and he knows that. And even now, he's still practicing 3 hours a day, and he's doing it for nobody. He's doing it for no one to listen to. And I think that's true love. I mean, I actually question my love for my instrument compared to my teachers, because I don't think I can do that. Wow. I think my practicing is fear-based. I think my practicing is about my practicing is making sure I don't lose it. Yeah. And the high profile of certain opportunities has mandated that I stay on top of my game. And that feeling. And it's terrifying. And I think it's an element of anxiety that comes with success that people don't want to talk about. Is that you're expected to be on your game the more you achieve. And I think for him to just love the instrument so much that he can't get through his day without having played it for 2 or 3 hours for zero reasons, for 0 gigs or 0 ears, tells you what kind of artist and musician he is. And so anyway, I hope when I'm his age that I will love my instrument that much still, that I'll still love music that much. And maybe that would be great for all of us, And
we're talking about the Earl V. Moore Professor of Music. And I realized I was standing in the Earl V. Moore building, and I realized how important Donald Sinta was to the whole world, University of Michigan, and the music world at large. Like, he brought everyone to Ann Arbor, along with lots of other people.
And Earl V. Moore was the dean. Earl V. Moore was the dean to hire Larry Teal and to create a saxophone degree.
Brilliant.
So, we have a beautiful history.
Yes. Well, it has been my pleasure to talk with my friend. You're on an episode called Friendcast. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much.
It has been a pleasure. I'm so excited to tell you at the time of recording of this podcast that 2 out of 3 finalists in the Fish-Off competition are the sax quartets from Dr. Timothy McAllister's studio here at the University of Michigan. Stay tuned to find out who the winner is. You can find Tim's website at timothymcallister.com. That's TimothyMcAllister. And on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, he's Timothy McAllister Sax. And check out his sax quartet, Prism Quartet. That's PrismQuartet.com. Join us next time on PorterFlute. It's our Stay Well, Play Well platform, and we're talking flute and food. I could think of no one better to include as a guest than Dr. Julie Kim Walker from Texas A&M Commerce. You can find more about me at amyporter.com and porterflute.com. And on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, I'm PorterFlute. Thanks for being here. I'm so grateful for you.